A few weeks ago, I'm at the doctor's office, and I get settled down, and there's these guys who had been there for a little longer than I had, and I overheard their conversation. I was eavesdropping a little bit. And the one guy says to the other guy, he's like, "No, actually, my mother-in-law, we have a lot in common. We both wish my wife had married someone else." I mean, you really hear some bizarro things at in the waiting room of a doctor's office. If you're visiting with us for the first time, we're in week number 2 of our sermon series, The Little Foxes. And basically, we kind of get this title for the series from a verse out of the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 15. And it says this. It's a husband and wife, and they're kind of talking together, and they say, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin our vineyards that are in bloom." And kind of what our goal or what our aim is with the series, what we hope would happen is that everyone in here, married or not, would recognize that there are little things in your marriage, little foxes, little tendencies that, if are left unaddressed for long enough, will ultimately destroy the most precious relationship that you have. Now, before we really dive into what we're going to talk about this morning, I want to offer you some hope. Maybe you're in here, and if you're being totally honest with me or with yourself, you would say, "Look, things are looking pretty bad in our relationship. There's all kinds of little foxes running wild." I would say this to you. God grows us through difficult circumstances, not around them. Our God grows us through difficult circumstances, not around them. So Moses went through the Red Sea. The children of Israel went through the desert. Daniel's faith was made manifest when he was in the lion's den. His friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their faith was put on display when they were in the fiery furnace. God doesn't protect Christians or Christian couples from troubles. He helps them walk victoriously through those troubles. Your marriage may be full of little foxes right now, but God can and will use such things to shape us into faithful warriors. Now, before we go any further, I need to bring out a special guest this morning. This person, very attractive, needs to hear this message as much as you or anybody else. So, why are you dressed like this? Goodness gracious. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Again, I said he's very attractive. He's been working out. I don't know if you can tell. He's in really great shape. His name is Frank. He's a dummy sometimes. And here's the thing. He doesn't have marriage figured out, right? His wife would tell you he is certainly a work in progress. But Frank needs to hear what we're going to talk about today as much as anybody. What we're talking about, the little fox that we're going to spend our time zeroing in on today, is the little fox of poor communication. And I think as married couples, sometimes we mistake passing along information for communication. And that can be very dangerous. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the FBI or its origins, but at its beginnings, at its inceptions, it was run by a guy named J. Edgar Hoover. And he ran the FBI with kind of an iron fist. And as a result, his subordinates were often bending over backwards to please him and placate him and impress him. On one occasion, a young agent was put in charge of the FBI's supply department. And in an attempt to impress the director and cut costs, he reduced the size of the paper that the FBI's memos were written on. Once the memo sheet made its way to Director Hoover, he had one look at it, didn't like it. He didn't care much for the spacing of the margins and quickly scribbled a message on the memo. It said, "Watch the borders." The memo circulated back through the Bureau, and for the next 6 weeks, it was nearly impossible to get into the United States from Canada or Mexico because the FBI was so focused on the borders. He's just ahead of his time, forget it. Commenting on the power of words, Zig Ziglar once noted, "What you say is what you get." Stories told of an older couple who were on vacation. They were seeing the world. They were taking their poodle along with them. Poodle's name is Fritz. And they're out, just kind of seeing the world. And they stopped in Taipei. And one evening, it's about dinner time. They're starting to feel hungry. And so they're at one of these little outdoor cafes. And they signal to the waiter that they're hungry and they want some food for themselves and for Fritz. And waiter immediately comes over, understands perfectly what they're asking for, and picks up the dog and goes into back to the kitchen and all that, and comes back about 40 minutes later with a platter of roasted poodle. Proverbs chapter 18 verse 21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." And if you don't believe that, ask Fritz the poodle. Our words have power. And what we say is often exactly what we get. So with this in mind, we must establish some good communication habits in our marriages, or we run the risk of having the most important of human relationships being destroyed by little foxes. So I want to offer 2 helpful habits that will keep little foxes from ruining your marriage and running wild within that relationship. The first helpful habit that I want to suggest that we cultivate today is the habit of becoming a more sensitive speaker. Now, Frank, before you tune me out, yes, I did use the word sensitive. Fellas, just hang with me for a second. Before you completely just stop listening, let me tell you a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. All right, you might know that Abraham Lincoln is the guy on your $5 bills. You might know that he is the president and 16th president of the United States. But Abraham Lincoln is more than just an important American figure. He's an important world figure. In his day, he was a towering individual. Physically, he was towering. He was about 6'4", which in the 1880s made you he was huge, right? But he wasn't just towering physically. He was also towering politically, even to today. He's famously emancipated the slaves, and he saved the Union. But his home life was terrible, was absolutely horrible. He was married to a lady named Mary Todd Lincoln, and the best way to describe her is she was a rattlesnake. Not my words, history's words. She had a hot temper, and she had an extremely short fuse. One day, she verbally assaulted a traveling salesman when he had showed up at the White House to sell them something. Back in those days, I guess you could just show up at the White House and be like, "You want a vacuum cleaner?" But she gave this dude a tongue lashing. And upset about this, the salesman goes up to the president in his study and explains to him what had happened. And the story is told that the president puts his arm around the salesman, and he looks him in the eye and he says to him, "My good man, you can endure for 15 minutes what I have endured for 15 years. Okay? To say that Lincoln's home life was stellar would be a gross overstatement. Mary Todd would verbally assault servants. She would spend money that the couple didn't always have. One time, while they were in public she threw coffee in the face of the President of the United States of America. Abraham Lincoln had it rough at home. And things weren't a whole lot better professionally either. Right? Everyone knew someone who'd lost someone in the Civil War, if they hadn't already lost someone themselves. Things had gotten so bad that folks were actually starting to call the war Lincoln's War. Right? So at every corner, President Lincoln faced overwhelming stress and devastating pressure. But the thing about President Lincoln is he lived with a kind of like a mystical sense that he'd been chosen by God to keep the United States together and preserve democracy. Now let me just ask you a question. If President Lincoln had lacked the character to persevere in a difficult marriage, do you believe he would have had the ability or the character to hold a crumbling nation together? His marriage was, in many ways, a training ground for his time as president. Lincoln's character was tested and refined on a daily basis, so when true tests came, he could stand strong. Ralph Waldo Emerson once offered one of the most succinct but also greatest and most accurate descriptions of President Lincoln. He described him in this way. He says, "He doesn't offend by superiority." Today we might call him folksy, but he often told stories and he rarely used his authority or his stature abusively. Men, this is important for us to note, to keep in mind. We can be powerful and we can be influential without having to throw around our title or our weight. In Colossians chapter 3, Paul advised, he said, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." Peter added, "Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Both Peter and Paul addressed our proclivity to be rough with our wives, not physically, but with our words and with our tone. And when Peter describes the woman or the wife as the weaker vessel, he's not implying that she lacks strength. What he's actually saying is that she is delicate. Something can be strong and at the same time also be very delicate. Any human, like this, I saw my first child born last year. We had a baby for the first time last year, and I watched my wife give birth to this baby. And I can just say, like, anyone that can birth a child is a warrior, right? And all the ladies are like, yes, right? If you've ever seen a baby born, you are not going to look at that individual later and say, as a weakling, right? My wife is strong, but she's also delicate. And I think that's what Peter's trying to communicate. And I'm learning this more and more every single day. I can't communicate with my wife the same way that I talk to my brother or my friends. I can be rough with them. We can be blunt with each other. We can sidestep emotion and hammer one another with facts and details and truth. But this approach will absolutely crush my wife. And that reality doesn't make her weak. It makes her delicate. And Peter said something really interesting at the end of that verse. He said, "So that your prayers may not be hindered." So I've got a daughter. I love her very much. And I keep telling her, stay away from guys, right? Told that to the girls in the youth group for years. Stay away from guys. They're trouble. They're terrible. Hopefully she will listen. But one day she may not. And she might bring home some dude. And if he treats her harshly, if his words are unkind to her, or he abuses her with his tone, or he barks orders or commands at her, do you think he's going to, in the very next breath, be able to come to me and ask me for a favor? Absolutely not. Unless the favor is, let me live, just go to prison. Okay. Absolutely not. There is no way that somebody is going to be allowed to abuse your little girl and then come ask you for a favor. And that's exactly what Peter's saying. Saying, look, don't be harsh with your wives. Treat them like the delicate vessels that they are. And if you do treat them harshly, don't expect God to listen to your prayers. You'd be kidding yourself. Now, ladies, I can't let you off the hook. I'm sure at this point you're thinking, that's a great sermon. Let's wrap this baby up, pray, and go get some chicken. But we can't do that, okay? Proverbs chapter 27, verse 15 says, a continual dripping on a rainy day and a contentious wife are alike. Trying to keep her in check is like stopping a windstorm or grabbing oil with your right hand. Proverbs 21:19, better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and nagging wife. Now, fellas, somebody did it in the first service and a couple of you are doing now. Don't chuckle at that. You cannot laugh. All right? This can't be the only verse you memorize. You need to know this. It will be bad. Okay? But do you see the picture that Solomon's painting? Like, women have a responsibility to be sensitive speakers as well. Anybody ever burned themselves on oil? Maybe you're changing the oil in the car or something like that, and you burn. Oil can maim you, right? And he's really particular. He says grabbing oil with your right hand. 90% of the people in the world, between 85 and 90% of the people in the world are right-handed, right? If 90% of the people in this room went and they grabbed oil with their right hand, guess what? Your life would look different for from now on. If you go grab oil, you're going to be scarred and you're going to be blistered, and you are not going to be the person you were yesterday. And I think that's what he's saying. Solomon is saying that a wife that nags and complains continually will wreck your life. It would be better for you to live in the lifeless desert than with a wife who refuses to speak sensitively. Paul flat out says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And Jesus' little brother James, he's even more direct as he admonishes his Christian readers. He says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongue deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. What he's saying is, look, you can come to all the church services you want, and you can hold down a seat for a while, and you can even pull out your bulletin and you can take notes from time to time. Or you can come to a Wednesday night prayer meeting, or you can be a part of the Man Challenge or whatever, ladies study. But when it comes time for you to interact with the person that you're supposed to love the most, and if you can't control your tongue, guess what all that religious activity is good for? Nothing. Nothing. As husbands and wives, we need to taste our words before we spit them out. Unless they're edifying or sweet, they need to be swallowed. We should continually be asking ourselves, is what I'm about to say going to build up or destroy? Christian husbands and wives who commit to being sensitive speakers will greatly debilitate and hamstring the little fox of poor communication. Second habit that I submit to you this morning that if we work on, our marriages will be so much better and our communication will be so much better, is we need to work on becoming a more loving listener. We have 2 ears, as the old adage goes. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we'll listen twice as much as we speak. Unfortunately, we spend the time where we should be listening to our spouse developing counter arguments. George Bernard Shaw once quipped, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has actually taken place. How many fights spiral out of control because when we should be listening to our spouse, we're busy building our case against them? How can we actually hear the concerns of the person we love if we're refuting their words before they even get them out? In his book, Thirsting for God, marriage expert Gary Thomas notes, the mark of a spiritual man or woman is a listening heart, not a lecturing tongue. President Franklin Roosevelt, who often endured long receiving lines at the White House, complained that no one really listened or paid attention to what was said at events like that. One day during a reception, he decided to try a little experiment. To each person who passed down the line and shook his hand, he murmured the phrase, "I murdered my grandmother today." As the President of the United States, this is awesome. And as he suspected, the guests responded with phrases like, "Marvelous. Keep up the good work. We're proud of you. God bless you." It wasn't until the end of the line, while greeting the ambassador from Bolivia, that his words were actually heard. Surprised and puzzled, the ambassador leaned over and whispered uneasily, "I'm sure she had it coming." "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this," James said. "Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry." It's been said that good listening is like tuning a radio. For the best results, you can only listen to one station at a time. Try to receive multiple stations at once, and all you'll hear is static. Listening is a choice about where we're going to set our attention. And so I just got to ask the question, how much better would our marriages be if we took the time to start living out these two habits? If we started to put them to practice in our lives, how much better would our marriages be? How much better would our communication be if we committed to becoming more sensitive speakers or more loving listeners? I was telling Chris earlier, look, I could come up with like 10 points, right? To talk about husbands and wives and communications. I could come up with 10 more points, as many points as long as my arm, but the truth is, if we will take these two and make it our aim to be more sensitive speakers and more loving listeners, I think things will change radically. What I want for your marriage and what I want for mine is I want for our marriages to look the way that the relationship between Jesus and the church looks. I want us to reflect the love that Jesus has for his bride. If we could get this loving each other and respecting each other thing figured out, if we could get this communication thing nailed down, our homes would be healthier, our families would be better, our communities would be stronger. And I submit to you this morning, if Christian husbands and Christian wives would start loving each other the way that Jesus loves his church, I think you would start to see people flocking towards the church and towards Jesus, because that is appealing. It's appealing when you see a husband and wife so in love with each other that they sacrifice for one another, that they continually try to outdo one another in righteousness. That's appealing. And if we were to model that for the world around us, I think God would be glorified, and I think his kingdom would expand. Ephesians chapter 5 said that Jesus loves the church and that he gave himself up for her. He sacrificed himself for you and for me because he loves us. He wants to make us holy, and He died so that that would be possible. If that message, the good news, the gospel, if that has never penetrated to your heart, I pray that today is the day that it happens. I pray that today is the day that all the static and all the noise and all the uncertainty is set aside, and you hear that Jesus loved you and He pursues you right where you are, and He wants you with Him forever. If you've never given your life to Jesus, you can do that today.